thank you to Manny for such a brilliant presentation. I'm very humbled by your appreciation for our organizing work. And as they say, the true sign of a genius is humility. And I'm really humbled by what Manny said. Since Manny has spoken about the global perspective, I shall start from a global view about the recent phenomena and recent changes that the working class movement around the world is undergoing. Since 2007, all of us know that we have been witnessing rising labor militancy in what has been aptly termed as Global South by many. And we have been witnessing spontaneous anti-capitalist movement, many spontaneous anti-capitalist movement, from the Arab Spring to Occupy Wall Street. Not all of them are necessarily working class movement. I don't agree with Slavoj Zizek, but I agree with his observation that OWS was not so much a movement of the dispossessed. It was the movement of the lower strata of the possessing sections of society that were threatened by dispossession due to the crisis. So I think it has a grain of truth about Occupy Wall Street. But yes, it had a very pronounced anti-capitalist character. And apart from that, the agitation in the Gezi Park in Turkey, the spontaneous workers' upsurges in South Africa, in China. The last 9 years have seen a spurt in labor militancy, in anti-capitalist movements, all of them mostly spontaneous, not organized by some revolutionary communist party. Later, many revolutionary communist parties intervened in these movements, but by default, they were mostly spontaneous. These movements, in my opinion, show two things. On the one hand, it has debunked the claims of the likes of Francis Fukuyama about end of history, end of ideology, and end of poetry, end of, everything, end of everything. As Zizek says, it has been easy to imagine the end of world rather than imagining the end of capitalism. He's talking about the apocalyptic movies and zombie movies. So this is the cinema, capitalist cinema, it trains you to imagine. It trains you how to imagine and what to imagine. So the Hollywood has been this gigantic cultural machine, imperialist cultural machine, which has been training us since many decades how to imagine change, how to imagine end, how to imagine beginning, how to imagine everything at all. So on the one hand, these spontaneous movements have debunked the claims of, even some left philosophers like André Gorz. In fact, Manny talks about André Gorz in his book, Southern Insurgency, and he rightly criticizes him, who bid a farewell to the working class in the 1960s from the left quarter. And there were people like Daniel Bell from the right corners who were talking about the death of the working class, the end of a post-industrial society, the end of ideology and all. But these movements have shown that it is not the end of history. Capitalism is not the end of history. Rather, capitalism has a history. And every ruling class tries to portray its rule as if it's the most natural form of rule. It has no history. It has no end or beginning. But these movements have debunked these claims. But at the same time, while debunking the claims of Tina, there is no alternative. What has been proposed by these so-called social movement, whatever that means, every movement is social. Which movement is not social? Even a fascist movement is a reactionary social movement, reactionary mass movement. So when you add an adjective, such an obvious adjective to a term like movement, I think there is something terribly wrong with this term, social movement. It's a term manufactured by the Bretton Woods institution in the post-Second World War era. All movements are social, by the way. So in the response of these claims of there is no alternative, there has been claims of there are many alternatives, Tama, which I think, Tina and Tama, it's what Deleuze has called disjunctive synthesis of binary of false alternative. Claiming that there are many alternatives, at the same time not suggesting one feasible alternative, one real alternative. And while ostensibly, phenomenally debunking the claim of there is no alternative and saying that there are many alternatives, actually proposing NGO kind of activism, uh, social advocacy, identity politics, and all. So, on the one hand, these claims have been debunked, and on the other hand, these spontaneous anti capitalist movements and their uh, consequent pettering out without actually achieving anything real. It only shows, I mean, it raises the question that is spontaneous anti capitalism enough? Is it enough for a subversive change? Is it enough for a revolutionary change? And that is the question which was there before Lenin also. In the beginning of the 20th century, at the turn of the century, in fact, when on the one hand he was welcoming the spontaneous workers' movement in what is to be done, he welcomes the spontaneous workers' movement, and he says, in fact, in that book itself, that and I quote, that the mass movement is the most important phenomenon. It is not to be disputed. But the crux of the matter is, how is one to understand the statement that the mass working class movement will determine the tasks? It may be interpreted in two ways. Either it means bowing to the spontaneity of this movement, that is reducing the role of social democracy to mere subservience to the working class movement as such, or it means that the mass movement places before us new theoretical, political, and organizational tasks far more complicated than those that might have satisfied us in the period before the rise of mass movements. On the contrary, we revolutionary social democrats are dissatisfied with this worship of spontaneity, that is, of that which exists at present moment. And this question, I mean, first as tragedy, then as farce, it has appeared again in front of the revolutionary working class movement in the 21st century. And I think we are in the valley of historical time. I mean, the descent has ended, and we are in a valley of historical time, and we are yet to undertake the ascent, and we are yet to make new beginnings in the working class movement. So this is a very important and critical time for the working class movement worldwide, and especially in the global south, because these are the countries we can term as hotspots turning as flashpoints. I mean, these are the, I mean, I believe in Egypt we had a revolutionary situation. In Egypt, we had a revolutionary situation twice within the span of 6 years. And we missed both of it, and that's why, as I think Daniel Guerin had said that, or Michael Kalecki has said that if we let the moment of socialism pass, fascism will be our punishment. And they are having a kind of a military junta, a kind of a very reactionary, very oppressive regime right now, because that moment has passed. And maybe that's why Lenin termed insurrection, he called it an art of insurrection. It is about understanding historically the moment with its historicity and with its contemporaneity. And that is the basic task of a revolutionary communist organization. Anyhow, my point is that, I mean, since the 1960s, when the Soviet socialism had collapsed, in my opinion, right after the 20th Congress, in which Khrushchev led this attack on Stalin's legacy. And that's debatable. I mean, there has been a debate within the communists about that between Paul Sweezy and Bettelheim. There are some people who are talking about actually existing socialism. There were people who were talking about the dichotomy between market and plan. There was a debate between Bettelheim and Al Szymanski in the 1950s also. There has been a lot of debate. It's my opinion. I'm not saying that's the last word on the subject. But in my opinion, when the Soviet socialism had transformed into social imperialism and it had committed its sins in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, there was a pathological reaction in the European left. And this pathological reaction was coming from quarters which were terming them initially as Maoist. People like Hélène Bédieu, people like Jacques Franchier, people like Michel Foucault. In the beginning, all of these, I mean, so-called post-structuralist, Althussite Marxists, also calling themselves, some of them at least, calling themselves as Maoists. They were, I think, the reaction which came after the Hungarian incident and the Czechoslovakian incident, it was a pathological reaction of the European left. They were not able to come to terms with the fact that a socialist country, the so-called socialist fatherland, the Soviet Union, can commit such sins. And in response to that, they actually ended up throwing the baby with the dirty water of the baby tub. So all the blame was laid on the party concept itself. I mean, someone as Maoist as Charles Bettelheim, he ultimately went to the extent of saying that the original sin was dissolution of the Constituent Assembly in 1917 by Lenin. So the actual culprit was not Stalin, it was actually Lenin in the third volume of Class Struggles in the USSR, that dominated the second part of the third volume of Charles Bettelheim's seminal work. So there was a kind of a pathological reaction which, rather than understanding the problems of socialist transition in the Soviet Union as well as People's Republic of China, it gave a very simplistic explanation of the failure. That was substitutionism, subjectivism, voluntarism, that the Soviet party became substitutionist. The party replaced the class, the central committee replaced the party, the Politburo replaced the central committee, the general secretary replaced the Politburo, and so on. So basically, ultimately, they threw the baby with the water of the baby tub, and they actually gave up the party principle. And that was the beginnings, not, I think, Laclau and Mouffe's work, Socialist Hegemony, in 1985. Basically, the beginning of post-Marxism was in the 1960s, in the confused Paris of May 1968, actually. So, and these are, and these tendencies have found a culmination in these post-Marxist theories, autonomous theories of Negri, Hart, Ellen Badiou. Some people are, it's a motley crew. Some people are talking about subtraction theory, that the entire bourgeois state is standing on the accumulated surplus of the working class. So if the working class withdraws, the bourgeois state will fall. But where will working class go? On the Mars? I don't think so. They call it changing the society, changing the world without taking power. That is not possible. They circumvent the question of power, the question of state, the question of smashing the state through a revolutionary process. So all of these tendencies have exacted a heavy price in the name of presenting what, in the words of Walter Benjamin, would be a redemptive activity on the part of the working class. It's not redeeming the past. It's actually, basically, rejecting. It's a rejectionist approach. It's a non-critical approach, ahistorical approach, which, in the name of criticizing the past, is actually closing that entire chapter without any critical assessment, a proper critical assessment of the Chinese and Soviet experiments, socialist experiments. And this brings me to the question of the basic Leninist idea of a vanguard party, because it has been one of the most abused, misused idea at the present, at least in the circles of the working class movement right now. And in my opinion, a lot of people have been criticizing this idea without properly understanding it. Basically, the struggle, the idea of party came into existence against a kind of a sociologism which was prevalent in the working class movement of Europe in the late 19th century. The idea of gradualism, the idea of fatalism, the idea of a kind of a crypto objectivist appropriation of Marxism, which said that, look, we have to concentrate on the economic struggles. We have to follow the objective developments. These objective developments will automatically lead to the development of socialism. This was done by Bernstein, who said, ultimate aim is nothing, movement is everything. It was done by Kautsky in a different way, transhistorically, in the early 20th century against Lenin. And it was done again by various operaistic, workerist, Trontiite tendencies in the 1960s, by autonomous Dutch Autonomia, for example, in the 1960s and 70s, and many other non-party revolutionist trends which came to dominate the European left in the 1960s and the 1970s. And actually, all of these criticisms, if you look closely, I don't find anything new in them. Most of these tendencies are a blend of various left-wing tendencies right from the period of Smirnov, Osinski, the left-wing communism in the Soviet Union, Bukharinist tendency, the left-wing Bukharinist tendency in the Soviet Union, later the worker opposition, led by Kolontai and Shlapnikov, and many other non-party revolutionists. You can date it back to 1911, in fact, in the Russian social democracy. The idea of Labour Congress as proposed by Axel Roth in 1911, which was rejected by Lenin emphatically. So and these ideas are basically, old wine in a new bottle. They can't claim novelty to a single essential basic concept that they are putting forward. For example, the thesis of multitude and empire and commons. When Arab Spring started, Negri wrote an editorial for The Guardian, and in that editorial, it was a very short editorial, he said that actually this is what we have been talking about. In a system where capitalism becomes an impersonal power, even the working class becomes an impersonal power. This whole concept of immaterial labor and biopower incorporated by Negri into the left ideology ultimately leads him to conclude that capitalism itself has become an impersonal power, intangible. It's like love is in the air kind of thing. And even the resistance to capitalist power becomes intangible, impersonal. It's a multitude, faceless. So capital is replaced by empire, a very vague thing. Private property, maybe socialist property, is replaced by commons, again a very vague thing, ideologically speaking. And the working class is replaced by multitude. Yet again a very vague, undefined, ideologically ambiguous thing, where you can't understand where to start. Who are you to fight? Who is your enemy? That is the actual question of power struggle. And these autonomous theses ultimately lead you to a kind of a passive radicalism. Actually, they gave this slogan, we need something more radical than Marxism, in 1960s in France. And actually this ostensibly more radical than revolutionary Marxism thing ends up as a passive, radical, high-sounding, empty rhetoric, ultimately, which doesn't have an operative part, which cannot lead the working class movement to wage any effective struggle against the onslaught of capital. And as Mani said, and he writes in his book brilliantly, that the claims about the death of the working class are completely misplaced. The working class today that we are witnessing it's the biggest working class in the history of mankind, as Mike Davis calls it, planet of slums. And the working class has a heartbeat, and I'm quoting Professor Ness, it has a heartbeat much stronger than before. It's thriving in the global south though, and the center of struggle has shifted. As Lenin also talked about it, that the storm center of revolution are shifting eastwards, and now I think they have completely shifted into the global south. And I won't take much time. I'll end on the basic my ideological prejudice. And prejudice is not a bad thing. Everybody has an ideological prejudice. Who claims he doesn't have one, or she doesn't have one, maybe they are not aware about it, but they have one. My ideological prejudice is that without a vanguard, no class in the history has been able to take power or maintain power or rule. Vanguard might take the form of party politics, might not take the form of party politics, because party politics is something very new in the history of the modern world. It started with the French Revolution, in fact, in the late 18th century. And maybe that is also a journey of spontaneity from spontaneity to consciousness, because earlier peasant revolts, slave revolts, they didn't need that modus vivendi, that political modus vivendi of party form. But as soon as the civilization develops, the humanity develops, and I don't question the idea of overall humanity progresses. Overall. Not in the short duration, but in the long duration, I don't believe this postmodern skepticism about the idea of progress. These are the most important beneficiaries of the progress that humanity has made, who are claiming that there is no such thing as historical progress. But these are the people who are sitting in the metropolitan capitalist academic centers, funded by Rockefeller, Ford, and all. So anyhow, I'll finish on this point that Poulanças, in his theory of capitalist state, says that the basic function of the capitalist state and the capitalist parties is to organize the collective class interests of the bourgeoisie, which might sometimes go against the wishes of individual capitalists. And sometimes the bourgeois state and the bourgeois parties implement policies which are actually against the wishes of individual capitalists and entrepreneurs and corporate houses. For example, Manrega was one such policy which was completely opposed to the wishes of the corporate bourgeoisie of India, corporate capitalist class of India, at least the bulk of the corporate bourgeoisie in India, and yet the state implemented it because the bourgeoisie, due to this competitive logic, cannot think politically. It can only think economically in the short term, for the short term profit. I mean, the same goes for the working class. When Lenin said that the socialist ideology and revolutionary ideology has to come from without, of the factory struggle, of the peculiarized contradiction between labor and capital, which is located at the factory floor, it can only become economistic struggle. And by default, by spontaneously, working class can only devise trade unionist consciousness, and it has nothing to do with any kind of disdain for working class consciousness. Actually, this theory is firmly rooted. It's firmly rooted in the Marxist theory of alienation, and very few people realize that the theory of vanguard party basically takes its cue from the theory of alienation. What Marx wrote in Economics and Philosophical Manuscripts in 1844, that working class is reduced to its animal functions. And that is happening in the global south right now. I'm not saying that it has no agency. I mean, sometimes people, economists and especially embedded economists of the post-Bretton Woods institution, claim that the Marxists don't give any agency to the working class. What kind of agency they are giving? Livelihood strategies. No collective class agency. One worker or one working class household, what kind of strategies it's devising? And they're complete, they go gaga over it. I mean, they, put up this ready wala, khoncha wala shops, and they pull rickshaws and they become peddlers and tinkers and tailors, and they say, look at this working class strategy, such a good way of everyday forms of resistance. How they are not passive victims of capital, they are actually resisting capital. And in this all high-sounding phraseology, what is being exacted? What price is being exacted? The collective class resistance or the working class is sacrificed. And the total, it's the Foucauldian turn, where he says you can't resist power collectively, because the moment you form a collective, you become yourself a victim of the basic logic of power. So the only way you can resist power is queer activism. You become so free that your very existence, that's, who said that? Your very existence becomes an act of rebellion. Camus, yeah, Albert Camus. So, okay, I agree with that to a certain extent, but it cannot replace the basic idea of class mobilization, class resistance, and working classes' collective struggle against capital. So, as Poulanças says, every class needs a vanguard to rule, a vanguard to take power, and that holds true for the proletariat itself. So I think we need to have a lively debate about the vanguard theory, Leninist vanguard theory, because it has been misappropriated in very vulgar fashion by many communist parties also, so-called Marxist-Leninist parties. And maybe I took a lot of time, but I would love that if we can have discussion on this need for a Marxist-Leninist party, a truly Marxist-Leninist party. Thank you.